Hello everybody. For this particular video, we're going to be addressing the ethical issue of the question of war and violence. War and violence, and specifically really looking at the question, or trying to answer the question of, is the use of physical violence ever justified? Is the use of physical violence ever justified? Now, we can think back to several different issues that have come to head in our culture in recent years, or maybe even just a few years back. The case of Trayvon Martin, for example, and all of the issues surrounding that, specifically as it relates to is it ever justifiable for a person who is a private citizen to use violence in reference to trying to protect themselves or trying to protect their community or anything like that. Of course, there are issues of race that are involved in that as well, but one of the things that came to head in that particular case was the use of the Florida state stand your ground laws. Stand your ground laws are sometimes called castle doctrines. These are laws that make it okay for a person to not have to try to flee or exit or de-escalate a situation before they resort to the use of violence. If they're presented with a threat, they don't have to first do everything within their power or conceivable within their power to avoid that threat or to back away, to escape the situation. The idea here is that if we make it necessary for a person to do that before they practice self-defense, then we're going to discourage people defending themselves. We're going to make it almost a crime for people to defend themselves. But stand your ground laws can also be very controversial in the sense that they can be used as a justification for someone to quite literally get away with murder. There was a case several years back where two people who were acquaintances, somewhat friends, they got into an argument, and anyway, one of them invited the other over to his house, and under the pretext of trying to make amends. The second person shows up at the house, and the first person shoots them, and then in court pleads that they were told that person to get away. They told that person to get out of the house. They weren't allowed in there. And so used the castle doctrine as a pretext to actually murder this person that they were arguing with. So those are very controversial, certainly. Then there's the issue of campus carry, and this is campus carry is the idea that in most colleges, particularly state-run colleges, or especially in state-run colleges, but in most other colleges as well, most colleges are what they call gun-free zones, and what that means is that if a student has the lawful ability to conceal carry or to carry a firearm elsewhere in the state, say they have a permit or something like that, they cannot do that on campus. And most campuses have a policy that if you want to go to college here, you cannot carry a weapon on campus. And so there are many students, though, and advocate groups that are fighting back and trying to get what they call campus carry legalized. And this is just the idea of extending a person's lawful status to carry a firearm to college grounds, especially those colleges that receive state funding. Why is the state involved in taking away a person's right to do something? Why are they involved in an organization that does that? And the idea here is obviously an appeal to the Second Amendment, and basically saying if a school accepts federal funding or state funding, then they have to abide by state and federal obligations to not prohibit someone from exercising their Second Amendment right. Of course, private colleges could do that if they wished, because they don't receive funding and that sort of thing. But there are advocate groups saying, look, we need to allow students to conceal carry on campus. Should that be something that's permissible? Another issue that really has come to a head in our culture is the issue of violence and law enforcement. Because of the YouTube and the live stream sort of culture that we live in, pretty much everything is on camera, right? And things that have gone unreported in previous generations now all of a sudden are finding their way to social media. Instances of law enforcement's abuse of power But setting that sort of issue aside, recognizing that there is a line over which people should not step, is there a case to be made that the violence utilized by law enforcement should be attenuated or lessened to some degree in certain cases and in certain contexts? So those are all issues, and there could be many more. We could name many more surrounding this ethical issue of war and violence. Now, obviously, the ones that I've been mentioning so far are more close to home. They're more localized, but these questions could span international to an international context as well. For example, is the use of physical violence ever justified when two nations go to war? And if it is, what are some of the situations or contexts under which it is justified? What do you have to do in order for it to be justified, and so forth? Well, we're going to be looking at those questions and really looking at some theories, 3 specific theories that have been developed that your book deals with. 3 specific theories in which to really look into what people have to say about this. What do different people have to say? The first view that we'll be looking at, your book refers to as realism. I'm not really happy with that particular label for it, because realism in philosophy means something completely different. But we'll go with it since your book presents it. Realism, and since I don't have another word for it or a better word for it, realism is the idea that when people are involved or nations are involved at war, whenever you're involved in war, you must do whatever it is necessary to win. You must do whatever is necessary to win. That a person or a nation or an army is allowed to make use of whatever means in order to accomplish victory and survival in the context of war. Now, the second view that we'll look at, and actually it's sort of a collection of minor differences on a view, is that of pacifism. And pacifism simply says that violence is almost never justified. There are very few, there are very few circumstances. In fact, a purist or a genuine pacifist would say that we should never use violence, that we should always have a positive commitment toward nonviolent ways or means to deal with aggressors and oppressors and this sort of thing. And then the third view that we'll look at is sort of the middle ground, if you will. And that doesn't mean that it's right or it's the right one, but it's simply people who recognize the weaknesses in both of the previous two and try to harmonize it in some way. People who agree with the pacifists that violence is a bad thing, and yet agree with the realists that sometimes war and violence are a sort of necessary evil. They're a means to an end to achieving peace. So just war theory says this. It says that the use of violence is sometimes permitted, but whenever it is permitted, there are limited. It needs to be limited in scope, and there has to be certain criteria met to determine which specific circumstances that it's going to take place. So limited in scope and justifiable only in specific circumstances, and that's just war theory. So let's take a look at these 3 views. The first one is realism, and realism is a pretty straightforward view on this topic. Realism says that whenever a person is involved in war, one is permitted to make use of any means in order to win. A person must make use of any means, whatever means are at their disposal, in order to win. War must be won no matter what the cost to the enemy. Now, basically, realism is an argument that says that the ends justifies the means. There are no limits to warfare. We can make use of whatever means we want to, whether that is a conventional sort of methodology, guns and tanks and this sort of thing. Maybe we make use of other kinds of weapons that are a little bit more mass and indiscriminate in their killing, things like napalm bombs, things like nuclear weapons or bioweapons, mustard gas, weapons of mass destruction, these sorts of things. That if we need to use those things in order to win, then we should pull out the stops and not have to worry about some sort of a moral problem that we have in our mind. Now, realism, as described here, is it basically sees life as a struggle for survival. And if you lose that struggle for survival, then you die and you go extinct. Your nation crumbles. Your people, terrible things happen. And so you need to do whatever is necessary in order to avoid losing when you're embroiled in this sort of battle. It is a consequentialist argument. The idea here is that the ends do justify the means. If we can achieve victory through peace negotiations and that's all that is necessary, so be it. But if it takes going to war, and that's the way that we must take, the path that we must take in order to achieve victory, then we'll go to war. And either way, we need to make sure that we do whatever it takes in order to win, in order to achieve victory, in order to prolong our success, and so forth. This particular view is a cost-benefits analysis. In other words, what that means is that people who adhere to this view, they will weigh the benefits versus the liabilities of going into war, and if not going into war means that we go extinct or that we become subservient to some other nation or whatever other ends that we don't want to happen, then we can do whatever we want to in order to win. Now, this view is often criticized as being too militaristic. That this view would lead, if followed through consistently, says its critics, it would lead to laying waste to entire civilizations. Think of all the non-combatants that might be impacted or affected through the various kinds of warfare, the machinery of warfare that we utilize. Back during the Vietnam conflict, there was all the time there were news articles or news media broadcasts that were coming over from there that were showing all of the quote-unquote collateral damage that happens when we're engaged in this sort of warfare. A lot of that was propaganda, but certainly there were some innocents or non-combatants who suffered greatly. And unfortunately, in the context of war, it's not just the government that is suffering, and it's not just the military and those who are ardently fighting for that cause who are suffering. Many times there are people who are not involved, people who are minding their own business, people who are just simply in their village trying to do their thing, trying to cobble together a life for themselves, and they're the ones that the war often harms the most. It's their children that are being dragged off and drafted into the military and then killed. It's their taxes that are being collected and spent in the prosecution of this war. It's their fields that are being harvested to supply the war effort, and it's their people who are being pressed into labor in order to build bombs and the machinery of warfare and so forth. And so, oftentimes, it's those people in that nation who are the most at risk, the lower classes, if you will, that have to bear the brunt of this war effort. And so it's not just the people who are sort of combatants that you're killing. It's an impact that goes across the whole nation. And realism is often criticized for being too militaristic in that way. But I wouldn't say that it necessarily is too militaristic. I think that might be an oversimplification of things. Because there are times, and could you name some? Could you name a time where a realist might suggest that we put a limit on the violence that we enact, that we sort of curb the violence and maybe enact different kinds of measures? I mean, think about what that might be. If this is a genuine cost and benefits analysis, then the realist is going to have to justify his use of violence based on the cost of it versus what he intends to achieve. So, to offer an illustration of why the realist would not necessarily want to make use of all the violence that they have at their disposal, one has to only think back to the Alamo. Now, if you're familiar with American history, the Alamo it is now located in San Antonio, Texas. And it was sort of a small chapel, if you will. And when I say small, it was kind of a little walled community that was in the middle of the desert that served as a halfway place in the desert. People could go and stop and get replenished in supplies and all this sort of thing before going into Mexico. Or Mexico could, people from Mexico could stop there and do some trading before they went into America. Well, the Alamo was in a place that was a disputed territory between Mexico and Texas at the time. And it constantly, this area constantly fluctuated back and forth. Sometimes it was under Mexican control, sometimes it was under Texan control, and so forth. Well, the fighting sort of went on and on and on. Well, finally, the Mexican general Santa Anna decided that he was going to go and take this territory once and for all. And in order to do that, though, he had to deal with the Alamo, because if he didn't deal with the Alamo and he just went past it and then tried to press on into Texas, then he would have an enemy at his back. So he had to deal with the Alamo first and overtake the Alamo. Well, there was an effort on behalf of Sam Houston, who was trying to raise an army in Texas. And people in Texas were just quite honestly tired of the fighting. They didn't want to fight with the Mexicans anymore. They didn't want anything going on there. They'd grown weary of it. It's like, look, just let them do whatever. It's just a bunch of desert anyway. Who cares? And they were tired of sending, their money, their children off to war and all this sort of thing. So he was having a very difficult time raising an army. Well, Santa Anna takes his army of several thousand people and he marches up to the Alamo and he says, basically, look, guys, we're here. We'll let you leave. You just need to leave your weapons or whatever, and then you can go on about your way. We're going to take control of this territory. Well, the people in the Alamo were like, hey, look, no way. We're not going to do that. In fact, if you try to do that, we will shoot you as you go by. And if you try to do that, we'll form an army and we will harry you as you try to invade further on into Texas. Well, basically, Santa Anna and his several thousand people surrounded the Alamo and starved it out for a number of days. And long story short, at the end of the day, the Alamo was overtaken, it was destroyed, and everybody in there was killed. When news of the fact that Santa Anna had destroyed everyone at the Alamo, including a couple of celebrities, right? Daniel Boone was there, and he died at the Alamo. Jim Bowie, the creator of the Bowie knife, was there. He died at the Alamo. And when news of that reached Texas, Sam Houston all of a sudden had a very willing population who was ready to sign up for his army to go out and fight against Santa Anna. And as the story goes, Sam Houston's army goes down there and they fight and they defeat Santa Anna overwhelmingly and basically eject him from that disputed territory. It was never disputed again. Now, this gets to our issue, though, doesn't it? Because here's Santa Anna. He has the means to utterly obliterate these people within his power. But when he did it, what did he do? Well, he galvanized his enemy against him. Before, his enemy was apathetic. They didn't want anything to do with war. They were tired with war. They were going to give him what he wanted. But once he destroyed the Alamo, once he made use of all the violence that he could and poured out his violence upon this little area, then the rest of the Texans were like, oh, it's on. It is on. We are not going to let you do that. Remember the Alamo was their battle cry. And so they went into battle. They defeated Santa Anna, and because he made use of this every means of violence, then he was defeated ultimately. So again, this is a cost and benefits analysis. The realist needs to make sure when they're going into this battle or when they're going into this war, they're gonna want to make sure that they have the ability to overcome whatever foe goes against them, right? Because that's going to be the cost of doing war. If they can't, then maybe they'll try to establish peace on some other means. Maybe they'll be like a terrorist, right? Because terrorists make use of all kinds of terrible tactics and warfare. Well, why is it? Well, it's usually because that terrorist is not big and strong enough to beat and face the enemy head on and beat them by himself. So that is their tactic. That's their way of making use of these various means of warfare in order to overcome and achieve victory. So that's realism. Now the second view that we'll look at is that of pacifism. And pacifism basically says that violence is almost never justified. Violence is almost never justified. Now, where realism was a consequentialist argument, Pacifism is what we call a deontological argument. If you recall, deontological arguments, deontological ethics are those ethical systems that stress one's duty or obligation. And what pacifism says is that humans are rational beings and therefore have intrinsic value. It is therefore never moral for a rational being to kill another rational being. And some would even go so far to say that it is never moral for one rational being to resort to violence to even harm another rational being. There are four basic versions of pacifism that I want to mention at least a little bit about and maybe give a definition to in order to show some distinctions of how people have thought about pacifism in the past. I would say, however, though, that probably only one of them is actual pacifism, maybe two, as we'll see when we get there, but certainly one of them is pacifistic. The other two are probably versions of just war theory because they do justify the use of violence in certain and limited circumstances. But we'll see that as we get to them. The first version of pacifism that people have held to is what we might call universal pacifism. And this is version number one of universal pacifism, and basically says that all killing or all violence is wrong. All violence is wrong, whether it's killing or whether it's harming another person. Basically, human beings are rational beings, and we should not treat them like objects or as animals, as if they could be controlled by violence or by killing. Rather, we should respect their humanity, and we should not cause violence to come upon them. The second version is universal pacifism number two. And universal pacifism number two is sort of a weaker version of that, and it basically says that all killing is wrong. All killing is wrong. Universal pacifist number two says all killing is wrong. And this view might say, well, we can use violence, but when we do, we should make sure that it's non-lethal in its effect. We should make sure that it doesn't actually bring about the end of a life of another rational being. So all killing is wrong, even if we have to slap somebody or punch somebody in certain cases. Now, the third version of pacifism that we'll mention here is what might be called private pacifism. Private pacifism. And private pacifism says that personal violence is wrong, but political violence might be justified. In other words, if somebody slaps me on the cheek, I should not resort to slapping them back. I should not, in my personal interactions with people, resort to violence in order to solve issues that we might have. We can talk about it, we can discuss things and whatnot. We can even give each other the silent treatment or never talk to each other again, but we need to respect one another's humanity and not give them violence. However, when it talks about political violence, what this means is warfare. It may be necessary for human beings in nations, in the context of nations, to go to war against one another. So that's private pacifism. I shouldn't harm anybody on a person-to-person level. In a civilized society, we should not resort to harming one another. We can talk about things. We can exchange ideas. We can reason things out. But there comes a time where we might have to go to war to protect ourselves against a force that is trying to harm us or attack us, or we might have to go in and help one of our allies protect themselves, and so warfare might be necessary. And then there's the fourth version is what might be known as anti-war pacifism. Anti-war pacifism. Anti-war pacifism is the idea that personal violence or violence on a small scale against people that we know, people that we're in society with, that might be permissible or justifiable in some cases. But warfare is wrong. Warfare is wrong for a myriad of different reasons, and they'll go into the idea that non-combatants often suffer the worst in warfare, that governments and government leaders seem to make it out just fine. It's the poorer people and that are often impacted the worst. And so warfare is wrong because of all of this. But in order to avoid warfare, sometimes it might be necessary for us to employ acts of violence toward one another. So, for example, we might be protesting a war, and they would say that if in the context or in protesting this war in order to bring about the end of this terrible injustice, if you have to, if you've got to go and harm some police officers or harm some public figures or something like that, then that would be justifiable so as to get rid of this greater evil of warfare. But that is anti-war, what is known as anti-war pacifism. And now, these last two, private pacifism and anti-war pacifism, I would say probably fall more under the category of just war theory than they do under pacifism. And the reason is because just war theory, the third version that we'll look at, or the third view that we'll look at, says that violence and warfare can be justified in certain contexts and in a limited scope. And that's exactly what these last two versions of pacifism are attempting to do, justify the use of violence in a certain context in a limited scope. So I would say that they're probably versions of just war theory. That really, of the four, the only really legitimate one is probably what we call the universal pacifist number one, who said basically that all violence is wrong. Because if you're using violence, if you're using non-lethal violence even, that might push the limits of pacifism. But the universal pacifist really, though, is the only actual pacifist. Now, let's take a little bit more in depth into that view, because that's the one that we're really going to be responding to now. It's the purest form of pacifism, and probably, as I was saying, is probably the only legitimate actual form of pacifism. And that is this. So pacifism, universal pacifism, is the idea that violence is almost never justified. Violence is almost never justified. Now, I remember when I was in college, I remember this bumper sticker that I saw. I laughed at it at the time, but it was on the back of, I don't remember what kind of car it was, but this bumper sticker that read, it showed the peace sign, and it showed the peace sign, and it says, "The footprint of the American chicken." Now, if you can remember, think about what a peace sign looks like, right? Looks like almost a chicken's footprint that has a circle drawn around it. And the notion here is that the idea that the pacifist, a person who strives for peace, the pacifist is simply, it's not that they want peace so much as it is that they are a coward to go and fight those who are evil or those who are bad. But I would say that while that might be a critic's assessment of what pacifism is, I would say hold up, not so fast, because pacifism doesn't say just run from your aggressor and try to chicken out on a fight. Pacifism is a positive commitment to nonviolence. And to be real honest with you, sometimes it's a whole lot more courageous to not resort to violence in the face of an aggressor than for some reason or another. It takes a lot more courage to do that than just to simply throw down and go fight with them. However, just because a pacifist is committed to nonviolence does not mean that the pacifist is going to let either A, run away from every fight, or B, let everybody treat them like a doormat. It's not as if the pacifist doesn't have any way of dealing with the aggressor or dealing with the issue. It's just that they are committed to nonviolent means of doing so. For example, the pacifist, in an attempt to address the aggressor, might resort to one of the following means. They might, for example, protest to bring social pressure. They might resort to boycotts or economic sanctions to bring financial pressure. They might resort to negotiations in order to try to express concerns to whoever it is that they're having difficulties with. It's not that they don't want to fight, and it's not that they're afraid to fight, it's not that they're wanting to back away from the issue and ignore the problem so as to be a doormat. Basically, it's just the idea that we commit ourselves to nonviolent ways of conflict resolution and resolving disagreement. So that's what the pacifist is. That's an accurate representation, I believe, of their view. However, think about what's going on in that situation. Think about what happens, for example, if you're wanting to protest in order to bring social pressure. Think about what happens when you are using a boycott, or when you are trying to address people about an injustice that is happening to your people. I think about people like Martin Luther King Jr., who did what he did. He would go into an area and he would He would have a protest. A lot of times those protests would end up with people trying to violently suppress them. And he suffered greatly at the hands of those who were racist at the time in order to push his agenda of civil rights and his agenda of equality. Now, why did he commit himself? Now, Dr. King specifically committed himself to pursuing things in a nonviolent way. He looked up to the Indian reformer Mahatma Gandhi, who embodied the doctrine of ahisma, which is basically the doctrine of nonviolence, of passive confrontation and this kind of thing. How does that work? Well, here's how the system of pacifism works. This is how they address things through nonviolence. Let me show you on basically this little graph that I've come up with here. Now, when we're talking about dealing with issues through the use of nonviolence or nonviolent means, we're always going to start out with a group of people who are oppressed. Now, this can certainly be different people in different contexts. This could be the black people in the South during civil rights. We could talk about the Jews under Nazi Germany. We could talk about women who prior to the 20th century didn't have a whole lot of rights in Western cultures, and so forth. Now, the oppressed does not need to be a minority in the community or in the society. However, the oppressed they do represent the people who are sort of disenfranchised. In other words, they don't have the influence, they don't have the means of gaining that influence, they don't have proper respect and that sort of thing in society. So there are the oppressed, the people who don't have a means of elevating themselves. And then there is the aggressor. And there's the oppressed and the aggressor. And sometimes the number, numerically speaking, the oppressed might outnumber the aggressor, but the aggressor has all of the institutional means of power at their hands. So, for example, like apartheid in South Africa, the African natives completely outnumbered the government and the people in authority there. But it was the people in the government and the authority that had the authority, and they had the power, they had the firepower to back themselves up. So in the context of a society where you have this dynamic, you have those who are oppressed, and you have those who are the aggressors, those who have the means of oppressing the oppressed. Now, there's a third group in society, and that third group are those who are largely uninvolved. Now, this may be people within the same society, like it was during the Civil Rights era. In the Civil Rights era, there was the aggressor, who were the racists. There were the oppressed. Those were the black people in those days. But the large majority of American society was just really uninvolved. They were apathetic toward the plight of those who were being oppressed. They didn't have to look at it all the time. They didn't know about it. They thought they'd done a great thing through the Civil War, and they'd already freed all the slaves, and so we've arrived, and so we don't need anything else, right? So they were uninvolved by and large, just going about their everyday life. So these three, the oppressed, the aggressor, and the uninvolved. Well, here's the relationship between them. The aggressor brings harm to the oppressed. The aggressor brings harm to the oppressed. They can do that by depriving them of rights. They can do that physically by physically accosting them, bringing harm, suppressing their freedoms, economically sanctioning them to bring harm on them, whatever the case may be. So the aggressor is harming the oppressed. Now, here's the problem for the oppressed. They can't really fight back because in this society, those who are the aggressor hold the privilege and they hold the higher social standing. So whether that means that they have all the guns or whether that means that they have all the authority, whatever that means, the oppressed find themselves in a position that they cannot fight back against the aggressor. So because if they did, they would find themselves extinct fairly quickly. So the oppressed, they don't have the recourse of trying to fight back. So what do? Well, they choose a nonviolent way of dealing with it, because to choose the route of violence is to ensure their own destruction. So the oppressed does what? Well, what the oppressed do is they seek help from those who are uninvolved. And we see they go and they petition those who are uninvolved to help them in their plight. And we see a great example of this in Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail. In that letter, as he was sitting there after he had been arrested at one of his protests, and he was sitting in the jail at Birmingham, Alabama, and he was writing this letter, and he was writing to clergy all over the United States, and he was showing them how wrong Jim Crow laws were, and he was developing an argument in order to spur them to getting involved. And so what happens then? Well, the whole plight of the oppressed at this point is to try to petition the uninvolved, those who are uninvolved, and then get them to become their allies in their plight for justice. So they seek help from the uninvolved and turn the uninvolved into allies to help their cause. Now look at how the scale of society has tilted. Because if they can successfully do this, if the oppressed can successfully petition the uninvolved so that they become allies, now what happens? Well, now the aggressor is outnumbered, and the ally, those who were previously uninvolved, come to the aid of the oppressed, and they present a threat to the aggressor. Now, there's a very real threat. So the ally then threatens the aggressor, and the aggressor backs off. And we see this in civil rights as the plight of MLK succeeds. More and more Americans get involved in the plight of civil rights. They put pressure on their politicians, on their representatives and their senators and the president, and they get laws passed that do away with Jim Crow, and they desegregate, and they begin the process of integration in the South. And that was fought in many places, fought tooth and nail. But ultimately, what happens? Well, the laws are changed, and with the laws, you got to understand the nature of law, right? Is such that if anyone is violating that law, what do we do? Well, we have not only the authority, presumably, but we also have the power to enforce those laws. And so those who are in the majority pass the laws, but not only do they have the laws, but if they have the authority, they have the power to put a real threat to the aggressor. And every single law that we pass carries with it the threat of enforcement. The threat of enforcement says if you don't obey this law, then there are going to be consequences. Maybe that's jail time, maybe that's a fine, but it very well could be that somebody shows up to your house with a gun and makes you do what they tell you to do. So that's the whole process of how pacifism works. But I want you to notice one thing, that even though the oppressed, that was the original group that was too small to do anything to help themselves, even though the oppressed did not themselves make use of violence, nevertheless, pacifism still depends on the threat of violence. Because what happens if the whole of society makes laws but then doesn't enforce them? Well, what happens is that the aggressor continues to aggress and ignores them. What happens if the aggressor does not fear the laws made by the rest of society? Or the aggressor does not see themselves as subject to those laws? We have a case in Arkansas during the Civil Rights era where Arkansas says, we're not going to pay attention to any of those those tactics of integration. What we're going to do instead is continue to segregate. Well, what happened? Well, what happened was that the president sent the National Guard down to Arkansas and said, no, you will comply. Or if you don't, you'll be at the business end of our rifles. So there's a threat of violence. So pacifism depends upon a threat of violence in order to achieve their ultimate ends. Now, they may themselves not be involved in violence, but there is a threat of violence. Now, we see this also with the Jews in Nazi Germany. The Jews did not have the ability to protect themselves. They were put on a train and they were transported off to internment camps, concentration camps, labor camps, things like that. They were systematically destroyed, murdered, and the Nazis, why didn't they change their ways? Well, they didn't fear the Allies it took the Allies coming in and exercising a very generous use of violence against them in order to get them to stop. So pacifism depends in and of itself at its core on the threat of violence. So some people say, well, that shows that pacifism is not really ever possible. They'll say, for example, that pacifists are left with the difficulty of how to use nonviolence to deal with a violent force, a force that is bent on violence. What are you going to do with that? They cannot be reasoned with. They cannot be bargained with. They're just going to destroy you unless you use violence against them. Are you going to sit back and go extinct, or are you going to do something in order to live? So there are some who see this as a contradiction within pacifism. So there are a number of problems there, right? So pacifism itself depends upon the threat of violence in order to achieve its ends. Pacifists are still left with the problem of how to deal with a force that is bent on your destruction, like the Nazis were on destroying the Jews. There has to be some sort of violence that is enacted there. And then thirdly, another problem, a significant problem that people have seen in pacifism, is the idea that if human life is truly intrinsically valuable, then should we not use means, even violent means, in order to protect it? If human life is truly intrinsically valuable, then it should be worth protecting. So pacifism has its issues. Now, let me be the first to say it's not without its merits. I think it's very commendable. But there are some very logical problems with pacifism as well. Is it even possible? And I'll let you to ponder that. But certainly there are some significant difficulties with it. Now, the third view that we're going to look at is that of just war theory. Just war theory. Now, just war theory says that violence is justified in limited and specific circumstances. Violence is justified in limited and specific circumstances. Now, you might ask yourself, what are these limited and specific circumstances? Well, the criteria that frame the answer to that question are two. And so the first one is jus ad bellum. It comes from the Latin, which means justness while going into war. Jus ad bellum. And the criteria of jus ad bellum is a set of markers, if you will, or a certain set of criteria for determining when it is justified to go to war. When can I be justified in going to war? When can I be justified in fighting against another nation? When can I be justified in utilizing violence in my own personal life if someone is threatening myself or someone that I love, or maybe even just innocent bystanders? Can I use violence in that context as well? So jus ad bellum, justness while going into war. The second set of criteria that we'll look at deals with, after we have already been involved in war, how are we to conduct ourselves in the context of warfare? And this set of criteria is known as jus in bello. Jus in bello. And jus in bello is a set of criteria for determining whether one is waging war in a just manner or not. It's a set of criteria for determining whether or not one is waging war in a just manner. Jus in bello. Now let's look through a few of these and see some of the criteria for each one of these. Now the first criteria that we'll look at with just war theory is that of jus ad bellum. In the first criteria in jus ad bellum that we'll look at is what is known as just cause. Just cause says that there must be a good reason for going to war. That if we're going to be involved in warfare, there must be a good reason for it. Now, throughout the history of the world, people have gone to war for several different reasons. Some of those reasons are better than others. Sometimes people go into war because they have been attacked, and this is the only way to avoid extinction. This is the only way to protect their hunting grounds. This is the only way to, whatever. But they've been attacked by another force, and so they've chosen to go to war with that force. Now, there have been other less noble reasons to go to war. It was said at the advent or the beginning of World War I that after a time of unprecedented prosperity throughout the Western world, people in that age were just spoiling for a war. They wanted to try out their new weapons and this sort of thing. And as it turns out, their weapons were very effective at killing one another, and as a result, many people died. But going into war just because hey, well, let's try our weapons out, that wasn't the only reason they did. But just the overwhelming sort of cultural disposition going that way, or going into war to expand your own territory, to take the resources of another people or something of that nature. Is that a just tactic and so forth? So just cause really examines the motive for going into war. Is it a good one? Is it a justifiable one? Or are you doing it just for no reason? Are you doing it just so that you can have control over the world? What is your reason for going to war? Well, the second criteria of jus ad bellum is that of legitimate authority. Legitimate authority. And legitimate authority says that only the rightly recognized authority in a nation or society can declare war. Only the rightly recognized authority in a nation or society can declare war. In other words, this really seeks to prevent things like rebel groups or insurgent groups from being representative of a nation. So, for example, if a terrorist cell within operating independently of the government goes and attacks another nation, well, they'll find out that those people of this terrorist cell were of this certain nationality, and therefore we're going to go to war against that country. Well, they weren't representing that actual country. Each nation has a body politic, if you will, within it that whose job it is, whose duty it is to declare war against other nations, to decide when we go to war. And if it's not that particular body politic, that legitimate authority that's declaring war, then it's not a just war. Now, keeping this one might have a few problems with it. This one might be a little bit difficult to discern because, for example, in the United States, the last time that the United States actually declared war on anyone, and of course, in the United States, the body politic that declares war, that has the authority to do that, is Congress. It's not the president. It's not the Supreme Court. It's not governors. It's Congress. Congress is the body politic in the United States that has been vested with the authority of the declaration of war by the U.S. Constitution. But the last time that Congress actually had a vote to go to war was actually in World War II. That was the last time Congress actually declared war against someone, which means that the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the war in Afghanistan, a couple of wars that we've had with Iraq, those had not been legitimately declared by Congress. Now, there are all kinds of political machinations that go on in explaining why we were over there and all this sort of thing. But at the end of the day, those were not legitimate American wars in the sense that they had been voted on by Congress and Congress had declared war. Now, they were certainly legitimate for the people who went out there. That was war, right? And they were legitimate in the sense that they did serve to advance American interests. But why they were never declared is a thing for historians to debate. Nonetheless, that is one difficulty with this this possibility, or with this particular criteria. The other one is that what happens when your nation doesn't actually have it spelled out who does declare war, whose responsibility it is, and that sort of thing. Or what happens when a government is working behind the scenes with groups within that nation in order to maybe fight a war by proxy, or maybe the government's working with a terrorist cell to reach out and harm a group that is bigger than them, that if they went to an overt war with them, they'd be systematically destroyed. So they work with a terrorist cell so that they can keep their hands clean, at least in the public eye, and yet still affect some sort of warfare against that other aggressor or that other nation. So there are some interesting issues with legitimate authority. The next criteria of jus ad bellum is proportionality. Proportionality says that whenever we're considering going into war, we need to make sure that the probable good produced by the war must outweigh the evils of war. War is quite frankly, war is terrible. It's a horrible thing to do. And that is even the case, even if you're and especially if you're military, you get in the middle of a battle and it's not fun to be shot at. And it's not fun to see your friends being shot at and being hurt, in some cases being killed. It's not fun to shoot back and then realize that you are actually shooting at other human beings and attempting to bring about the end of their lives. War is evil because it brings on famine, it brings on destruction, property damage, infrastructure devastation. It devastates people who are quite frankly not involved, children and innocents and non-combatants. I guess innocent's a bad word to use, but non-combatants are drawn into the conflict and they're caught in the crossfire. War is a terrible, terrible thing, even in the best of situations. However, sometimes just war theory says war is inevitable. It's necessary, and when we are considering to go into war, we need to weigh the cost and benefits. War is evil, but would it be more evil to let these issues go unaddressed and let these tyrants go unchallenged, to let this evil that is taking place in the world as a result of whatever it is that we're trying to stop here, would it be worse to just let evil take its course? For example, in the case of World War II with Adolf Hitler, as he was gallivanting across Europe, basically conquering nation after nation, and then just destroying people who were not even trying to fight against him. Should we have? That was a horrendous evil. Should we have just let that go? Well, certainly not. We did what we should have done. We got involved and we tried to stem the tide of evil, even though it was at the cost of millions of lives, even though it was at the cost of billions of dollars in all likelihood, and all kinds of things like that. Still, the good accomplished outweighed the evil at the end of the day. But not all wars can that be said to be the case. But proportionality is certainly a criteria. Now, the next criteria that we'll look at under jus ad bellum is that of last resort. Last resort. Last resort says that violence is only justified after all other means of settlement have been exhausted. In other words, we've got to try negotiations first, and then we might try some sanctions, and then we might try a sort of a boycott or something of that nature. We might cut off diplomatic relations, this sort of thing. We might try to use our allies to leverage pressure against whatever nation it is that we're having this disagreement with. Whatever the case may be, the criteria of last resort says we need to go through a process of trying to deal with this first without having to resort to bloodshed, without resorting to violence. So warfare must be a last resort. And then there's the criteria of right intention. The criteria of right intention. Now, this is similar to the criteria of just cause, but a little bit different. It's nuanced a little different. The criteria of right intention says that war should always have the goal of peace. War should always have the goal of peace. In other words, we don't go into war seeing how badly we can mess up our opponent. We don't want to go into a warfare with the idea in mind of prolonging this warfare. We don't go into warfare for the purpose of expansion and continually expanding or colonizing. We go into war with the intention of establishing peace in the region and helping that peace process flourish. That's really the only reason we should go to war. Well, we've looked at jus ad bellum, just cause, legitimate authority, proportionality, last resort, right intention. The next set of criteria has to do, however, jus in bello, has to do with while we are in war, what principles of justice should we be focused on there? What are some things that would determine whether if we're executing warfare in a just manner? Well, the first one here echoes the previous, is that of proportionality. And proportionality, when considered in the context of jus in bello, means one should be focused on limited objectives, using no more force than necessary. One should be focused on limited objectives, using no more force than necessary. In other words, we're not going to be doing a General Sherman thing, and just, burning our way to the sea. Referring to General Sherman during the Civil War. We're not going to just be burning down the world, We're going to focus on limited things and take out what we need to take out and destroy that which we need to destroy, but no more. We want to keep the rest intact so that when the peace process begins, we have an easier way of getting it up and running. So as we're conducting warfare, we need to pay attention to the criteria of proportionality. The next criteria of jus in bello is that of discrimination. And discrimination is, in this case, what basically says that we need to go out of our way to make a distinction between those who are combatants and those who are non-combatants. And force should be directed only toward military targets and combatants, and non-combatants should be left alone. This is what prevents us, for example, from just bombing civilian territories. Unless those civilians are firing on us, at which case it's questionable whether they're civilians or not. We don't engage that, right? So discrimination says we need to make a distinction between military targets and other things, and we need to focus the use of force against those military targets, against those who are actively in a combatant role. Now that can be very difficult sometimes, though. The criteria of discrimination can be problematic, especially when our enemy uses that against us. For if our enemy knows that we're going to attack certain areas and not areas, they might kind of move things around a little bit on us so that we can't tell exactly where the combatants are. To give you an example, I have a friend who was a combat medic in Vietnam during the Vietnam conflict. He's written a book about this. It's kind of a small little book on Amazon. But anyway, he wrote a book about this. And as he was, part of his job as a combat medic is at certain seasons he would go and they would have a centralized location where they would get all their medical supplies, gather there, and then they would make runs out into the various places where soldiers held forts and positions in various places to deliver supplies to them. And so they would take a caravan and they go driving it down the road until they found, they rendezvoused with the group that was out in the field. They would resupply them and they would come back and get more supplies and this sort of thing. Another thing that they would do is they would go into surrounding villages and try to affect goodwill on the people. And they would help them medically, and so they would go and do various minor medical things, and in the process of that, to also foster goodwill with the locals, they would have some of the locals sometimes come in and help and restock, and they would pay them some money, and so that would be a way of people in the neighborhood being able to have a job and and getting to know the soldiers and trust them and this sort of thing. Well, all of that happened. So he would be at the major installation at the medical facility, and he would get to know some of these people who would come in and work. And he got to know one young lady pretty well. She was in her teens, and she would come in there. She had a family. He had actually been out to their house on helping one of the family members in some medical way. But he had gotten to know them in this sort of thing. One day, though, as they were going out to take a delivery of medical supplies to people on the front lines, they were ambushed. Their caravan was ambushed, and the front vehicle was disabled because it was hit with a rocket and disabled. And in order to do that, they're going to try to clear the road. Well, my friend got out of the car that he was in, or the transport that he was in, and he had his shotgun with him. He was going to go up and try to get this other vehicle out of the way. And as he was doing that, there was a soldier, a Vietnamese soldier, Viet Cong, that charged him and held his gun up, ready to shoot. Well, my friend got to his gun first and shot that person. and that person fell over and died. And well, he didn't even look back at the person. He saw that the person had fallen over, ran up, he got the transport out of the way, and on his way back, as he was coming back to the transport, happened to look down and see that soldier. And what he thought was a soldier was actually one of the young girls, that young girl that he had seen coming in to resupply at the base. And she had charged him with a rifle, trying to kill him in this part of the ambush. So those very people had been involved in restocking and resupplying at the military base. How do you know who's a combatant and who's not? Sometimes it's not immediately apparent. Sometimes the combatants can disguise themselves. Well, the last criteria of jus in bello that we'll look at is the criteria of what is known as intrinsically evil means. Intrinsically evil means. And this is basically the idea that there are certain forms of violence that are in themselves evil. Things like weapons of mass destruction, torture, looting, this kind of thing. These are evil things. And these should be avoided in warfare at all costs. It doesn't matter if it can be justified in the sense that it'll save more lives and this kind of thing. These are things that we all agree not to use. So things like mustard gas and bioweapons and nuclear bombs and napalm and flamethrowers and landmines, things that do not discriminate when they kill. These things are intrinsically evil. Using torture on someone, looting a village after you've fought people there, and this kind of thing. All of these things are intrinsically evil, and these need to be avoided at all costs. So that's just a list of things that we just don't do. Things means that we don't employ, and these kinds of things. So just war theory, though, has these two sets of criteria: jus ad bellum and jus in bello. And as long as we are fighting in a way that is justifiable on both, so we've got good reasons to go to war, and we're conducting ourselves justly while in the context of war, then it's arguable that the use of violence in those situations is justifiable. And now those same criteria, however, don't just apply to large-scale conflicts, but they can apply also to our personal conflicts as well. So you've heard of if we are attacked, we can use violence to defend ourselves, or if we are in the prosecution of trying to enforce the law, perhaps we can use violence there. But even in that situation, we shouldn't use overwhelming violence and this kind of thing. So those same criteria can be applied in many ways on a personal level as well. Well, this has been a brief discussion, really, about violence and warfare, and the question of, is the use of physical violence ever justifiable? Make sure that you read the syllabus, check on any discussion forum postings or quizzes that you need to take, and finish those. And we will see you in the next video. Have a great one. Bye-bye.